Every time the camera flashed, the faces appeared except his. A boy erased from every photograph but not from the world. And the reason why still chills the soul. Thomas Henley had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of estate sales, where dust-covered boxes held the remnants of lives lived and lost. On a gray October morning in 2023, he found himself in the cluttered attic of the Whitmore estate, a Victorian mansion that had stood empty for nearly 3 decades. The elderly owner had passed without heirs, leaving behind rooms filled with antique furniture, yellowed documents, and countless photographs spanning generations. Thomas, a freelance journalist specializing in local history, had permission from the estate lawyers to document any items of historical significance before the demolition crews arrived. It was beneath a stack of moldering ledgers that he discovered the photograph that would consume the next month of his life. The image was mounted in an ornate silver frame, tarnished black with age. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical family portrait from the late 1800s, a stern-faced couple standing behind 2 children in their Sunday finest. But something was profoundly wrong with the picture. Where the face of the youngest child should have been, there was only a ghostly blur, as if the boy had moved during the long exposure. Yet his body remained perfectly still, his small hands clasped neatly in front of him, his posture identical to his older sister beside him. Thomas lifted the frame closer to the window, squinting at the strange distortion. The blur wasn't random. It had an almost intentional quality, as if something had deliberately obscured the child's features. Even more peculiar, the boy's reflection was missing from the polished surface of a small mirror, visible in the background of the photograph. His sister's reflection was clearly present, as were those of their parents. But where the boy's face should have appeared in the mirror, there was nothing but empty space. On the back of the frame, someone had written in faded ink, "The Ashford family, summer 1877. May God forgive us for what we've done." Below that, in a different handwriting, someone had added, "Benjamin disappeared October 15th, 1879. His shoes found by Miller's Creek. No body ever recovered." Thomas felt a familiar thrill, the same sensation that had driven him to uncover the truth behind dozens of local mysteries over his 15-year career. There was a story here, buried beneath layers of time and silence. He carefully wrapped the photograph in cloth and placed it in his satchel, along with several other documents that bore the Ashford name. The demolition could wait. This mystery demanded immediate attention. Back in his cramped apartment above the antique shop on Main Street, Thomas began his research. The Ashford family had indeed lived in Millbrook, just 2 towns over from where the Whitmore estate sat. Property records showed they had owned a modest home on Elm Street from 1875 to 1880, when the house was suddenly sold to pay outstanding debts. City records confirmed that Benjamin Ashford, age 7, had been reported missing on October 15, 1879. The search had lasted 3 weeks before being called off, with authorities concluding the boy had likely drowned in Miller's Creek during an autumn flood. But Thomas had learned to read between the lines of old newspaper accounts, and something about the official story felt rehearsed, sanitized. The Millbrook Gazette's coverage of the disappearance was surprisingly brief. Just 3 short paragraphs buried on page 4, despite missing children being front-page news even in that era. More troubling still, Thomas found no mention of the strange photographic phenomena that the inscription seemed to reference. If the boy truly couldn't be photographed properly, surely that would have been noteworthy enough for the local press to mention. As the afternoon light faded, Thomas studied the photograph under his desk lamp, using a magnifying glass to examine every detail. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that the blur over Benjamin's face wasn't accidental. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. It was as if someone or something had systematically erased the child from every image, leaving only the vague outline of where he should have been. His phone rang, startling him from his concentration. It was Margaret Chen, the head librarian at the Millbrook Historical Society, returning his earlier call about the Ashford family records. "I'm glad you called," Margaret said, her voice carrying an odd tension. "We do have some materials related to the Ashfords, but I should warn you, you're not the first person to ask about them recently. Someone else was here just last week asking the same questions." Thomas gripped the phone tighter. "Did they leave a name?" "That's just it," Margaret replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The man claimed to be researching his family genealogy, said his great-grandfather was Benjamin Ashford. But Thomas, according to all our records, Benjamin Ashford never grew up to have children." The next morning found Thomas driving through the winding back roads to Millbrook, the mysterious photograph secured in his messenger bag. The town hadn't changed much since his last visit 2 years ago. Still the same weathered storefronts and tree-lined streets that seemed frozen somewhere between 1950 and today. But now he saw it through different eyes, wondering what secrets lay buried beneath its sleepy facade. Margaret Chen met him at the Historical Society, a converted Victorian home that served as both museum and research center. She was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and Thomas could tell immediately that something was troubling her deeply. "Before I show you what we have," she began, leading him to a back room lined with filing cabinets, "I need to tell you about yesterday. The man I mentioned, he came back. This time he was different, more agitated. He kept asking about photographs, specifically whether we had any pictures of Benjamin Ashford. When I told him we didn't, he became quite upset." She pulled out a thick folder marked Ashford Family, 1875 to 1880, and spread its contents across the research table. "What's strange is that we should have photographs. Most prominent families from that era donated their pictures to us, and the Ashfords were well regarded in the community. Jonathan Ashford owned the largest grain mill in the county. But every photograph we have of the family shows the same thing." Thomas opened his bag and carefully removed the photograph he'd found. Margaret gasped when she saw it, her face going pale. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "This is identical to the 3 we have in our collection, down to the smallest detail." "But that's impossible. This appears to be an original, not a copy." She showed him the Historical Society's photographs, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. They were indeed identical. Same poses, same clothing, same ghostly blur where Benjamin's face should be. But these were clearly different photographs, taken from slightly different angles, suggesting multiple shots during the same session. "It gets stranger," Margaret continued, pulling out a leather-bound journal. This belonged to Edmund Hartwell, the town's photographer in the 1870s. Listen to this entry from August 12th, 1877. She read aloud. "Attempted once again to photograph the Ashford boy today. 5th session this month. The camera functions perfectly with other subjects, but something about young Benjamin causes the most peculiar distortions. Mrs. Ashford grows more distraught with each failure. She speaks of curses and divine punishment, though for what transgression I cannot fathom. Have recommended they seek spiritual counsel. Thomas studied the journal entry, noting the photographer's increasingly erratic handwriting as the entries progressed. By September 1877, Hartwell's notes had become almost frantic. The boy appears normal to the naked eye, yet no photographic medium can capture his likeness. Even stranger, mirrors seem to reject his reflection. I fear I am losing my sanity, yet the evidence is undeniable. What manner of child cannot be seen by silver and glass? The final entry, dated October 1st, 1877, was barely legible. Have destroyed my equipment. Cannot continue this unholy work. The boy's mother came to me weeping, begging me to try once more. She claims the child grows more transparent each day, as if he is fading from this world entirely. I told her I could do nothing more. May God forgive us all for whatever we have witnessed. Margaret closed the journal with trembling hands. Hartwell left town shortly after that final entry. Never practiced photography again, according to his family records. But here's what's really disturbing. I found a police report from 1879, filed just days before Benjamin's disappearance. Someone reported seeing a translucent child wandering near Miller's Creek at night. The witness claimed the boy cast no shadow in the moonlight. Thomas felt pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. Margaret, I need to see everything you have about the Ashford family. Every document, every record, every mention in the local papers. They spent the next 4 hours combing through boxes of materials. Thomas discovered that Jonathan Ashford's mill had been the site of a tragic accident in 1876. A young worker named Samuel Morrison had been killed when he fell into the grinding machinery. The official investigation had ruled it an accident, but a handwritten note in the margin of the incident report suggested there might have been more to the story. More disturbing still were the medical records Thomas found in Dr. Harrison Blackwood's papers. The town physician had documented several visits by Benjamin Ashford's parents, expressing concerns about their son's unusual constitution. Dr. Blackwood's notes described symptoms that defied medical explanation. The child felt cold to the touch even on warm days, showed no reaction to bright lights, and seemed to require very little food or sleep. "Look at this," Margaret said, pulling out a church registry from St. Mark's Episcopal. Benjamin Ashford was baptized twice, once as an infant in 1872 and again in 1878, just a year before his disappearance. The second entry is in a different hand, and there's a notation that says emergency rite performed at parents' urgent request. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to piece together a picture of a family in crisis. The Ashfords had been pillars of the community until 1876, when Jonathan's mill accident had somehow changed everything. After that, the family had become increasingly isolated, rarely attending church or social functions. Neighbors had begun whispering about strange sounds coming from the Ashford house at night, crying that seemed to echo from empty rooms, and the sound of small footsteps in the attic when the family was away. The most chilling discovery came in the form of a letter Margaret found tucked inside the pages of an old hymnal. Written by Benjamin's mother, Elizabeth Ashford, and dated just weeks before the boy's disappearance, it was addressed to her sister in Philadelphia. "Dearest Ruth, I write to you in desperation. Our Benjamin grows more distant each day, as if he exists only partially in this world. The accident at the mill changed him somehow, though he was nowhere near when it happened. Jonathan blames himself, says we are being punished for our sins. The boy speaks of seeing Samuel Morrison in his dreams, of being called to join him by the water. I fear we are losing our child to forces beyond our understanding." As Thomas read the letter aloud, Margaret suddenly gripped his arm. "The man who was here yesterday. I just remembered something else he said. He claimed that Benjamin Ashford never died, that he had been living all these years, waiting for someone to discover the truth about what really happened at the mill." Thomas looked up from the letter, his mind racing with possibilities both logical and supernatural. The mystery was deepening, but he was beginning to sense a pattern, a thread connecting the mill accident, the boy's strange condition, and his ultimate disappearance. "Margaret, I need to visit the old mill site, and I think I need to have another conversation with this mysterious researcher who's been asking about Benjamin." The ruins of Ashford's mill stood like broken teeth against the gray October sky, half-collapsed stone walls choked with 40 years of ivy and neglect. Thomas approached the site just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown foundation where Miller's Creek still flowed, its waters dark and swift beneath the crumbling remnants of the water wheel. He wasn't alone. A figure stood among the ruins, an elderly man in a worn overcoat, his white hair wild in the evening breeze. The man turned as Thomas approached, and their eyes met with a shock of recognition, not because they had met before, but because Thomas immediately knew who this must be. "You're the one who's been researching Benjamin Ashford," Thomas called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The man nodded slowly. "And you're the journalist who found the photograph in the Whitmore estate." News travels fast in small towns. He extended a weathered hand. "My name is Dr. Samuel Morrison, named after my great-uncle, the man who died in this very spot in 1876. Thomas felt the pieces of the puzzle suddenly rearranging themselves in his mind. "Your great-uncle was the mill worker who was killed in the accident. But what does that have to do with Benjamin Ashford?" Dr. Morrison, who appeared to be in his 70s with the bearing of a retired academic, gestured toward the remains of the mill wheel. "Everything, I'm afraid. You see, it wasn't an accident that killed my great-uncle Samuel. He was murdered, pushed into the grinding mechanism, during an argument with Jonathan Ashford over wages. Jonathan's 7-year-old son, Benjamin, witnessed the entire thing." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Benjamin saw his father commit murder? "More than that, Doctor." Morrison continued, his voice heavy with old sorrow. "The trauma of witnessing such violence, combined with the terrible guilt of keeping his father's secret, seems to have triggered something in the boy, something that medical science of the 1870s couldn't begin to understand or explain." Dr. Morrison pulled out a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. "I've spent 30 years researching this case, ever since I inherited my great-uncle's effects and discovered his journal. Samuel had been documenting Jonathan Ashford's increasingly erratic behavior in the months before his death. Missed payments to workers, violent outbursts, and paranoid suspicions that his employees were stealing from him." Thomas examined Samuel Morrison's journal, noting the neat handwriting that grew increasingly urgent as the entries progressed. The final entry, dated the day before his death, read, "Jonathan threatened me today when I demanded the wages he owes. Said he would rather see me dead than pay another cent." The boy Benjamin was present and heard everything. I fear Jonathan is losing his mind, and I worry for that child's safety. But that still doesn't explain the photographic phenomena, Thomas said, though even as he spoke, he was beginning to form a theory that chilled him to the bone. Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. I believe Benjamin's trauma manifested in what we would now recognize as a severe dissociative disorder. The boy essentially began to withdraw from reality, to make himself invisible as a psychological defense mechanism. But something about the specific nature of the trauma, combined perhaps with the folk beliefs of the era about guilt and spiritual contamination, seems to have made his invisibility literal as well as metaphorical. As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the shadows near the creek. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he saw a translucent form, barely visible in the fading light. A young boy in 1870s clothing, standing at the water's edge exactly where the Ashford family had claimed to find Benjamin's shoes so many years ago. My God, Thomas whispered. He's still here. Dr. Morrison showed no surprise at the apparition's appearance. I've been coming here every October 15th for the past 5 years, ever since I finally pieced together the truth. Benjamin never drowned in Miller's Creek. He simply faded away, consumed by the secret he carried and the guilt he felt for his father's crime. The ghostly boy turned toward them, and Thomas could see that his face was the same indistinct blur that had appeared in all the photographs. But now, in the growing darkness, the boy's form seemed more solid, more present than it had appeared in decades. He's been waiting, Doctor, Morrison continued, waiting for someone to discover the truth about what happened here, to finally give voice to the testimony he was never allowed to give. My great-uncle Samuel was never properly buried. Jonathan Ashford claimed the body was lost in the mill machinery. But I believe Benjamin knows where his father really hid the remains. The apparition began to move along the creek bank, glancing back at Thomas and Doctor Morrison, as if beckoning them to follow. Thomas felt a strange compulsion to pursue the ghostly child, as if Benjamin Ashford was finally ready, after nearly 150 years, to reveal the full truth of what had happened in this place. As they followed the translucent figure deeper into the overgrown ruins, Thomas realized that the mystery of the unphotographable boy was about to reach its climax. The secret that had tormented a child so deeply that it had literally erased him from the physical world was finally ready to be told. Dr. Morrison paused at the edge of a depression in the ground, partially concealed by fallen stones and decades of accumulated leaves. This is where Benjamin has led me before, he said quietly. But he's never stayed long enough for me to excavate. I think he's been waiting for the right witness, someone who could tell his story to the world. Thomas knelt beside the depression, and as he began to clear away the debris, the ghostly boy's form seemed to grow slightly more solid, his blurred features almost resolving into a recognizable face for the first time in generations. Benjamin, Thomas said softly, addressing the spirit directly. We're going to help you. We're going to tell everyone what really happened here, and we're going to make sure your great-uncle Samuel finally gets the justice he deserves. The apparition nodded once, and for just a moment, Thomas could swear he saw the boy smile, the first clear expression the child had been able to make since that terrible day in 1876 when his world had shattered. The truth has waited long enough, Doctor, Morrison said, pulling out a small archaeological trowel. It's time to bring my great-uncle home. The excavation took 3 hours, working by the light of powerful, LED lanterns that Thomas had retrieved from his car. What they uncovered beneath the centuries of accumulated earth and stone would validate every supernatural element of Benjamin's story, while simultaneously providing the concrete evidence needed to expose the very human crime that had started it all. Samuel Morrison's remains were exactly where the ghostly boy had led them, buried in a shallow grave beneath what had once been the mill's loading dock. The skeleton was largely intact, and more importantly, it showed clear evidence of trauma, consistent with a violent assault rather than an industrial accident. The skull bore fractures that could only have been caused by repeated blows from a heavy object, likely the iron rod they found buried alongside the bones. But it was the second discovery that truly shattered Thomas's understanding of the case. Wrapped in oilcloth and somehow preserved despite the decades underground, they found a child's diary. Benjamin Ashford's own account of the events that had led to his supernatural condition. Dr. Morrison read aloud from the water-stained pages by lantern light. "Father made me promise never to tell about Uncle Samuel. He said God would punish our whole family if anyone found out what happened at the mill. But the secret makes me feel sick inside, like something is eating me from the inside out. Mother says I'm getting thinner every day, but I don't think she means my body. I think my soul is disappearing." The entries grew more disturbing as they progressed, documenting Benjamin's gradual withdrawal from the physical world. "The mirror in my room doesn't show me anymore," Mother cried when she noticed. "Father says it's because I'm becoming holy, that God is making me invisible, because I'm keeping his secret. But I don't feel holy. I feel empty." Thomas found himself deeply moved by the child's attempts to understand what was happening to him. The diary revealed that Benjamin had tried desperately to become visible again, believing that his condition was punishment for his silence about his father's crime. He had confessed to the family priest, Father McKenna. But the clergyman had been Jonathan Ashford's close friend, and had apparently chosen to keep the secret as well. "Listen to this entry from September 1879, Dr. Morrison continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Uncle Samuel comes to me in my dreams now. He's not angry, just sad. He says the only way for both of us to rest is for the truth to come out. But Father says he'll hurt Mother if I ever tell anyone. I don't know what to do. I'm so tired of being invisible. Maybe it would be better to disappear completely." The final entry, dated October 14, 1879, just one day before Benjamin's reported disappearance, contained the most heartbreaking revelation of all. "I found Uncle Samuel's bones today, where Father buried them by the creek. Uncle Samuel's spirit was there, and he told me it was time. He said I've carried this secret long enough, and that someone will come someday who can tell our story properly. I'm going to put this diary with him, so when they find his body, they'll understand what really happened. I hope Mother will forgive me for leaving, but I can't stay invisible forever. It hurts too much." Thomas looked up from the diary to see that Benjamin's ghostly form had become more solid throughout the excavation, as if the uncovering of the truth was allowing him to reclaim his existence. The boy's face was finally clear, a thin, solemn child, with dark eyes that held far too much sorrow for someone so young. Dr. Morrison carefully wrapped the diary in his coat. "Now we understand why he could never be photographed. The guilt and trauma literally made him invisible, first to cameras and mirrors, then to the human eye itself. But he never actually died. He simply faded out of existence until someone could vindicate both him and my great-uncle. As they prepared to leave the excavation site, Thomas felt compelled to address the spirit one final time. "Benjamin, we're going to make sure everyone knows what really happened here. Your father will finally be held accountable, and Samuel Morrison will get the proper burial he deserves." The boy nodded, and for the first time in nearly 150 years, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper on the night wind, but clearly audible. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for making me real again." As dawn broke over Miller's Creek, Benjamin Ashford's spirit began to fade, not into the tortured invisibility that had plagued him for so long, but into the peaceful rest that had been denied him since childhood. Thomas and Dr. Morrison watched as the boy's form grew translucent and then disappeared entirely, finally free to leave the world he had been trapped in for almost a century and a half. The excavation site would soon be swarming with police, archaeologists, and forensic experts. The remains of Samuel Morrison would be properly identified and given the burial they deserved. The diary would serve as evidence in a case that would reopen historical records and force the town of Millbrook to confront a long-buried injustice. But for Thomas, the most important discovery wasn't the bones or the diary, or even the resolution of the mystery itself. It was the moment when Benjamin Ashford had finally been seen, truly seen, for the first time since his childhood trauma had begun to erase him from the world. Standing beside the creek as the sun rose, Thomas understood that some mysteries are worth solving not for the answers they provide, but for the peace they bring to those who have waited far too long for justice. "The boy can finally rest, Doctor," Morrison said quietly, packing away the last of their equipment. "And so can my great-uncle Samuel." 3 months after the discovery at Miller's Creek, Thomas stood in the Millbrook Historical Society, watching as Margaret Chen carefully arranged the final exhibit in what had become known as the Benjamin Ashford Memorial Display. The mysterious photographs were now part of a comprehensive exhibition that told the complete story, from Samuel Morrison's murder, through Benjamin's supernatural disappearance, to the eventual uncovering of the truth. The case had attracted national attention, particularly from paranormal researchers and psychologists interested in the intersection of trauma and unexplained phenomena. Dr. Morrison had become something of a celebrity in academic circles, publishing a paper titled "Psychological Manifestation of Guilt: The Ashford Case," study that had been featured in several prestigious journals. The legal ramifications had been complex, but ultimately satisfying. While Jonathan Ashford had been long dead, the case had been officially reopened, and his conviction for murder had been entered into the historical record. Samuel Morrison's remains had been interred with full honors in the Millbrook Cemetery, with a headstone that finally told the truth about his death. Perhaps most significantly for Thomas, the story had launched his career to new heights. His book, The Invisible Child, a true ghost story, had become a bestseller, and he'd been approached by several documentary filmmakers interested in adapting the tale. But more important than any professional success was the knowledge that Benjamin Ashford's story had finally been told. Margaret had received numerous donations for the Historical Society following the publicity around the case, allowing them to digitize their entire photograph collection and create a proper archive for future researchers. She had also established a fund for investigating other impossible historical cases, instances where the official records seemed to contradict physical evidence or eyewitness accounts. It's remarkable how many people have come forward with their own family mysteries since the Ashford story broke, Margaret told Thomas as they walked through the exhibition. Apparently, there are quite a few old photographs in attics around here that show similar unexplained phenomena. Makes you wonder how many other secrets are buried in small towns across America. Thomas paused before the central display case, which contained the original photograph that had started his investigation. Benjamin's image was still blurred, but somehow it seemed less tragic now, more like a child playing hide-and-seek than a tortured soul trapped between worlds. Dr. Morrison joined them, carrying a fresh bouquet of flowers that he planned to place at Samuel's grave. At 73, he had found a new purpose in life, establishing a foundation dedicated to investigating cold cases with potential supernatural elements. "You know," he said to Thomas, "Benjamin wasn't the only child to witness terrible things in that era. Industrial accidents, domestic violence, crimes that went unreported. There could be dozens of similar cases out there waiting for someone to care enough to investigate." The three of them stood in comfortable silence, contemplating the broader implications of what they had uncovered. The Benjamin Ashford case had proven that some mysteries existed at the intersection of the supernatural and the very human. That trauma could manifest in ways that defied conventional understanding, but that ultimately truth and justice were the most powerful forces for healing. A young girl visiting the museum with her parents pressed her face against the display case, staring at Benjamin's blurred photograph with fascination rather than fear. "Why can't we see his face?" she asked her mother. "Because sometimes," her mother replied thoughtfully, "people carry secrets so heavy that they become invisible. But when someone finally helps them tell the truth, they can be seen again." Thomas smiled at the inadvertent wisdom of the explanation. It was perhaps the most accurate summary of the entire case, a story about the weight of secrets and the redemptive power of truth. As closing time approached, Thomas made one final stop at Miller's Creek before leaving Millbrook. The excavation site had been filled in and marked with a small memorial plaque, and the ruins of the old mill had been stabilized to prevent further deterioration. Standing by the water's edge where Benjamin's shoes had been found so many years ago, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion. The creek flowed peacefully in the late afternoon light, no longer haunted by the spirits of the past. Somewhere in whatever realm exists beyond the physical world, a 7-year-old boy who had carried an unbearable secret for nearly 150 years was finally at rest, his story told, and his sacrifice acknowledged. Thomas pulled out his phone and called Dr. Morrison, who had become not just a collaborator, but a genuine friend. "Samuel, I've been thinking about what you said regarding other cases. I think I'd like to help with your foundation. There are probably more Benjamins out there waiting for someone to see them." "I was hoping you'd say that, Doctor," Morrison replied, and Thomas could hear the smile in his voice. "I've already received 3 letters from people who claim to have similar photographs. Apparently, the invisible children of America have been waiting a long time for someone to pay attention." As Thomas drove away from Millbrook for what he knew would not be the last time, he reflected on how the discovery of a single mysterious photograph had changed not just his understanding of the past, but his vision for the future. The Benjamin Ashford case had taught him that some stories transcend the boundary between the living and the dead, and that the most important mysteries are often the ones that help heal old wounds. The invisible boy who couldn't be photographed had finally been seen, and in being seen, had shown others the path to their own redemption. Some secrets are too heavy for children to carry alone, Thomas said to himself as the lights of Millbrook faded in his rearview mirror, but they're never too old for adults to finally share.